Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session, Understanding the Latest Apprenticeship Assessment Changes. My name is Stephen King, Technical Education Specialist with the SDN Mesma Group, and it's really good to be with you in partnership with Aptem this morning. Today's session is designed to help you make sense of what's changing in apprenticeship assessment, what's confirmed, but what's still developing, and what it all means for how we design, deliver, and assure programs moving forward. We know the reforms are significant, but they also present a real opportunity to strengthen how assessment supports learning and reflects occupational competence more effectively. Before I hand over to Emily, it's worth saying that we're now getting a much clearer picture of where things are heading, but we don't have all the answers. The direction of travel is towards a more proportionate and integrated approach, where assessment can take place during the programme, not just at the end, and where training providers take a greater role in delivering and marking assessment, supported by awarding organisations for oversight and moderation. That shift has some important implications for how we design curriculum, assure quality, and work collaboratively with EPAOs or AOs, and that's exactly what Emily will be exploring with you today. So with that, I'll hand over to Emily Hughes, Strategic Associate with SDN Mesma Group, to take us through what we know so far and what it means in practice. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everyone. Lovely to see so many familiar names and faces, well, not faces, but names on the delegate list today as those of you come and join us this morning. So as Stephen said, we're going to have a look through where we're at, what we know, and some of the thoughts and things that are coming through as information becomes clear. But what we do need to keep in mind is that there are still things that are being worked through. We don't have every answer at the moment, but we are getting a clearer picture week on week of what some of these reforms will look like and how they will impact both providers and assessment organisations. What we want to do today is really tease out some of what we know so far, but also ask ourselves some questions, both that we would look at as ourselves, but also that we need to be working across the sector to answer. So we're going to have a look at what we do know. What's the direction of travel? So where's it come from? What's it telling us? And where do we anticipate we're going to end up? What are the implications of some of these changes? And some of them will be bigger than others in terms of impact, but it's interesting to really start to tease out some of that on a practical level and think about how that may impact the way we work day to day and also strategically. And also have a look at some of those questions we should be asking of ourselves, of each other, and also in that wider sector, forums, networks, discussions as well. And then finally, we absolutely want to give you some takeaways. What should we be starting to look at now, in the near future, but also in the next few weeks and months, over maybe even what could be up to a year in terms of planning and execution. We've allowed lots of time at the end for questions to come through, so please do pop them in that questions tab. It's the one with the question mark at the top. Stephen is beavering away in the background, reading through all of those, and we will absolutely try and look at as many as we can at the end. So let me give you a bit of a starting point as to what do we know and where are we travelling to. So some of you will have been much more across this over the summer as some of these reforms have been announced and as detail have come out. Others of you may not have been quite so up close to it. So I want to just give us an opportunity to just remind ourselves and get us all on that same page as to what we know about what are we looking at and where's it coming from. So what we know, and Stephen touched on this in the introduction, is that there is a real drive to make assessment more proportionate. So historically, EPA has been received incredibly well by employers and sector bodies as being that real rubber stamp of competency, that independent rubber stamp of competency for each and every apprentice that's receiving that certification. However, there were places where it was felt that maybe assessment was duplicating elements that had maybe already been looked at, maybe through a mandated qualification, or maybe some of the assessment plans were maybe assessing the same thing 2 or 3 different ways, which may have felt a bit repetitive or in excess. So the first driver behind these reforms is that proportionality. It's about what can we do to still bring the rigor of that occupational competency that was the absolute driver of those reforms following the Richards Review all those years ago, but at the same time maintaining that proportionate balance of assessment and reliability. And so what it's looking at is removing duplication where practical and possible and appropriate. There's also the look at assessment plans as a whole. And where appropriate, assessment plans will be redesigned to allow some assessment to take place on programme. So up until now, as we know, learners were on programme. There may have been formative assessment that was happening as part of that developmental process of learning, development, refinement. What will now potentially happen is, rather than there being a gateway and then a big single high stakes endpoint assessment, is there will be a proportion of that assessment that can happen on programme. Now, what's important to recognise that this isn't necessarily going to be a free-for-all in terms of anyone can do anything as part of that on-programme assessment, and we'll tease that out a little bit later. But what it does mean is there's not this single high-stakes end point at which it's a bit make or break. There is that brilliant balance between on and end of programme assessment. And then thirdly, what we have is that training providers may be able to deliver some of that on-programme assessment. So where historically EPA was always done by that independent endpoint assessment organisation, or in the case of an integrated degree apprenticeship, it was done by independent assessors, there is that proportionality in that balance where some of that on-programme element will now be undertaken by the training providers. And how that will happen and the approvals and oversight of that, we're beginning to get a much clearer picture on, and we'll have a look at a little bit of that today. So in terms of what do we know and where's this come from, just as a quick reminder, we had published much earlier in this calendar year the DfE Apprenticeship Assessment Principles, which have been that underpinning element to these reforms. And following that, we also had a consultation from Ofqual. So Ofqual are the regulator for the majority of the endpoint assessments. Now, OFS sits in that space for integrated degree apprenticeships. And there are some standards where actually there is a different regulator. So, for example, the GOC sit in that space for dispensing optician, for example. And there is forces ones around some of those military-based standards as well. But for the majority, and for many of you on the call today, it is Ofqual who are that regulator. And they are the body that oversee that endpoint assessment and regulate that endpoint assessment activity. And they put out a consultation between June and August that looked at how that regulatory space may need to adapt to reflect the new approaches to this apprenticeship reform, and how some of those activities around on-programme assessment, what would that look like in terms of that regulatory oversight? What would be some of the requirements for the assessment organisations to make sure that validity and reliability of those on-programme assessments, and that bigger approval space for those organisations? So that consultation closed in August, and they are in the process of looking at and beginning to refine their response to those reforms. And FAB, the Federation of Awarding Bodies, and other organisations are working together with the AOs to look at that consultation response as it's published and look at how this will all happen in practice. So for those of you, and that is the majority of you that are providers on the call today, what this will mean is this is the bit that helps the awarding organisations you're working with shape the way they will oversee the assessments that you may now be potentially undertaking on programme. So now we've got that starting point, let's get you guys involved, because it's not just about me talking at you today. Let's hear about a little bit from you guys. So we're going to pop up a couple of polls to see where we think you are at the moment. So Nadine, if you could pop the first poll on the screen, that would be great. And you will be able to pop in your responses to this. So I will give you a moment or two. So which reform areas are you most concerned about? So what's the bit that's in your head that you're really concerned about at the moment? So we've got some people there, a little bit around employers assessing behaviours, and we're going to tease that out in a minute. Oh, they're all bobbing up and down. Delivery of assessment, combination of internal and external assessment. I'll give you another 20 seconds and then we'll see where the results end up. Reasonably evenly split, give or take. Another 10 seconds just for those of you who've not got there yet. I can see 30% of you are still to vote, so please do vote. It is important because it helps me shape the content as we go through this morning. Brilliant. Okay, so if we share the results there, what you will see is that there is a majority of people, well, 33%, a third of you feel that it's around that employer assessment of behaviours, and absolutely, we'll tease a little bit out about that today. But following in a close second and third, and we're not far off between the two, there's that combination of internal and external assessment and providers delivering assessment. So absolutely, we're seeing both of those come through. Nadine, if you could share the second poll, that would be great. So let's build on what we're worried about. So let's flip the coin. What are we confident about in terms of that reforms? Are we confident in some of these changes as an organisation or individual? Or are we a bit on the fence? We're okay with some of it, we're not sure about others? Or are we really worried and we're really not quite sure how we're going to manage and tackle this? Okay, about 50% of you have voted, so I'll give you a few seconds for the rest of you. Oh, there we go. Oh, this one's much more clearly split. Brilliant. Okay, so we've got the last few coming in. Excellent. So what we can see as we share the results is 71% of you are fairly or somewhat confident. 10% of you very confident. I love it. You're already on it. You feel really confident. You're able to respond to this. And then about 19% are not confident. So hopefully after today, some of you will feel more confident heading away from this. But we'll see how that moves. Now, what's interesting is that we ran these polls about a month ago with a different group, so it's not identically comparable. But actually, the results were similar, but not identical. Employer assessment of behaviour, everyone seems to have concerns about this. The management of it, the validity of it, and some of those, and we'll have a look at that this morning. Interestingly, third and fourth on this poll is exactly as reflected us again this morning. That combination of internal and external assessment, and you guys as providers delivering that assessment. And similarly, most of you, and for the previous delegates that we did this poll with, are fairly confident. Some more so, some less so. But what's interesting is the split is almost the same. A couple more in the somewhat rather than the very, but actually, give or take, it's about the same. So as a sector, we seem to be fairly consistent in where we feel we're confident or not in response to these reforms. And that's absolutely right. There's lots of unknowns still in this space. There's lots of unknowns within your own organisations about the how and the what are we going to be doing. But also, people are beginning to see where they've got existing experience they can build on, but also being a bit more realistic about where those gaps are and why that may be that you've got a bit of a lack of confidence in particular areas. Now, what we haven't done today, but I thought might be really useful, is to show you some of the things that people have said are opportunities and challenges of this. So the first is about opportunity. And there absolutely is lots of opportunity and positivity that can come from these reforms. And the biggest one that I'm hearing about as I work with providers and assessment organisations is that flexibility and that movement of ownership of assessment. And that's really interesting. But what I'm also really liking hearing across the sector is about the timeliness of assessment, the empowerment, the streamlined approach in places. And these are really great things that we should absolutely be grabbing onto and building on as we go through. But similarly, people are still concerned, and rightly so, because there is lots of unknowns. But there's concern about change, speed of change, breadth of change. Lack of resource within providers is one of the biggest ones, and actually AOs have got a very similar concern. And lots of concern about the kind of unfamiliarity of this space for some providers, but also how the machinery of government is still working through this, and actually that's impacting the speed at which we get some of the answers that we want. So let's just take a moment to think about these changes and what they know, what we need to know based on them. So there are 8 core areas. So the first of which is that there is now that combination of external independent assessment and that expert provider-based assessment. And that's really important. There is that opportunity there. Now, many providers who are maybe delivering mandated qualifications or other provision that already has qualifications behind it will be more familiar in this space. That said, there are still some indications it will be slightly different in the sense of AOs that used to be called EPAOs. They will be setting the assessment that the provider will then be delivering and administering. So this is not necessarily the free-for-all that in the very early days was perceived, that you can just assess however you want and whatever you want, and then the AO will just do a bit at the end. There is very much a feel that this is going to be an AO-led and provided assessment that is then essentially facilitated and delivered by that provider. So there isn't that free-for-all element in there, but that's going to bring with it restrictions and requirements as well as the opportunities that come with that. That said, providers could deliver and mark those assessments, but they must have that adequate oversight and quality assurance. And that's going to be within the provider's internal structures. So we're looking at a much more rigorous IQA quality oversight function that maybe where there's no mandated qual is there, but not in that same formal or more rigorously administered way. And there will also be that additional layer of the awarding organisations EQA, the external quality assurance. And some providers may not be as familiar with that, or definitely not familiar with it in that apprenticeship space. Assessment plans will be much more concise. They are anticipated to be much shorter. Originally, it was going to be 2 pages, but we're already hearing word that they may be slightly longer than that. And we are beginning to feel that we've got a bit more information in that space. So originally, it was, this is what's going to be assessed. Everyone can do it their own way. But we are beginning to hear that there may be more prescription in that space, and it's still being bottomed out. So it's not a definitive done deal, but it is absolutely our understanding that there will be one prescribed assessment method within the EPA, and then the trailblazers will also recommend or discount other particular methods. So it won't necessarily be completely different from one AO to another, but there may be some variability. And that's something providers will absolutely need to think about as to what AOs you're working with. Why does their approach suit your students? Would you potentially need to work with more than one AO because there's different opportunities? Or will one AO offer more than one route? These are all things that we're still teasing out. The fourth element of the changes is around that terminology to help improve clarity and consistency. Well, at the moment, it might not feel like that, and that's fine. This is about the change from things like EPAO to AO and move to things like apprentice assessment, and changes for things like gateway. So you will get used to new terminology over time. But what we also have to recognize as a sector is we're going to have 2 systems running concurrently for a while. So we need to be really clear, what terms are we using for which parts of the system or which cohorts of learners? And within your provider, you need to be clear in terms of how you're doing and managing that. We also know from the funding rules that apprenticeships may now be reduced down to 8 months rather than that 12. And you may think, well, how does this relate to assessment reforms? That's funding. Well, in terms of the reforms, if once the new assessment plans come through, you are then looking at that on-programme delivery, but you've only got 8 months of on-programme. You've really got to have that rigorous assessment design that's allowing for those correct assessment points as set by the assessment activities that the AO will provide. But also, what about resits or sequencing, and what about the what ifs within that? Because 8 months is such a short period of time. So for those looking at those shorter standards, it's not just about a shorter amount of time to gateway and EPA in the old system, but it's about that rigor of new curriculum design, the robust building of assessment points that still facilitates new learning prior to it, but also allows enough time for resits, retakes, relearning as appropriate. And that's going to be a real art, especially for those shorter apprenticeships. We've touched on behaviours, but let's just take a moment. Behaviours will now sit with the employer, who will be there to validate, to rubber stamp that they have been demonstrated and developed to that required level. It's not going to be part of that formal assessment model, but we still want to know that it's valid and reliable. And how that is going to be administered, signed off, agreed, what evidence is needed, is still information we're waiting to have absolutely clarified for us. But there is an anticipation that this will absolutely need to be woven more rigorously into those progress reviews, into that on-the-job learning, into that tracking and monitoring, but also how employers are inducted just as much as apprentices onto programs. And how are you as providers really thinking about what does that look like? As we get information, how will we include that in our apprenticeship curriculum design, as well as our materials and our support materials for employers, not just apprentices? The other difference is that at the moment, you could not select an EPAO until much later in the programme. But the new reforms will require you to have that AO in place at the start. And what's really important to recognise is it's not just about putting down a name of an AO on an ILR return. This will be for you as providers securing approval from that AO, because if you are doing some of their assessments, there may very well be some approval processes that you will have to go through to evidence policy, process, staff competency, staff qualifications, you know, breadth and depth of staffing to allow for those assessments to happen. And so it's not just about, oh, we're going to start someone in 2 weeks' time, or we'll pick this AO. There is a much longer pre-running process that will have to happen prior to the start of an apprenticeship, rather than it happening maybe once they're on programme and it's just about contracting and finding the one that you want. So that's going to make a real shift to the way you're working and who you're working with. And sitting behind this, and I talked about it earlier, is that regulatory space, that Ofqual, OFS, and those other regulators, and all of the infrastructure that's sitting with them that will inform the way that AOs operate, that will in turn inform the way that they work with you as providers, and that you will then deliver assessment. And within that, there is also a recognition that maybe some providers will not be in a position from day one to undertake those assessments. And it may be that the AO needs to be delivering and facilitating those on-programme assessments. And I know there's been a lot of talk, and I've been working with providers in this space to really look at, is this a transition where maybe initially the AO does some of the assessment, then they do part of it, and then the provider does all of it for the on-programme elements? Maybe where staff don't have the full qualifications or experience, or there isn't sufficient staff resource. And it's about how that AO provider relationship will work. And how that will work and evolve over time. They're the 8 areas of significant change and things that we need to know. The other thing that some people did miss over the summer, so I do like to flag it, is that apprenticeships have moved. So they've moved from the Department for Education to the DWP, Department for Work and Pensions. And with that may come some tweaks and amendments and changes that we haven't yet seen. And so again, this is a space that we need to be watching. So with all that in mind, I promised that I'd give you things to think about, questions you should be asking yourselves and your AOs. So things to think about, where are the opportunities? And absolutely, there's lots of opportunities within these reforms for providers. There's an opportunities around how you structure your curriculum, about the way you're working with your AOs, about the revised ways you're going to work with employers, especially around behaviours. And that may aid their engagement in things like reviews and other activities, because they have a bigger role to play, especially in that behaviour space. But how is this going to align to your strategic and business plans? What is your strategy? What are your business plans? And how are these reforms and the requirements of these delivering those, but also giving you wider opportunities as well? You also need to start thinking about who in your organisation needs to be involved, and who externally do you need to be involved as part of this change process. So I've been talking to some providers about sort of that stakeholder mapping, and really thinking about, oh, it's not just about X team leader and those assessors. there's a real web of people and infrastructure internally and externally that you need to be engaging in this change process and that change planning. So who needs to be involved? Have you really sat down and thought about who, how, when, what, all of those kind of questions? And how will your working relationships with awarding organisations change? At the moment, quite often they're very transactional. Here's a student, you assess them, thank you very much, send them back. But it's going to now be a much more evolved relationship. There's going to be approvals, there's going to be ongoing discussion and back and forward with the assessment materials. There's going to be that EQA, there's going to be those ongoing requirements. And actually, is this an opportunity to really think about what do you want from your AO? And is the AO that you've been using for EPA the right one that's going to give you that wraparound support in this new way of working? And actually, is this where you need to be really thinking about what do you as a provider need and who is going to give you that as an AO? And actually, it may be the EPAO is not the right AO for you in this new space. Or it might be they are exactly the right people, but how do you need to evolve and change that relationship? But what we have to remember is that AOs at the moment don't have the new standards and assessment plans. They don't have the outcomes from some of those regulatory consultations. They will have some information, they won't have it all. So how are you going to work with them as that information comes through, as this evolves, so that it supports you and they also have that space to do what they need as well? And what are the timelines? What needs to happen now, but what needs to happen as each standard is revised? So as many of you will know, there are 5 standards that have been drafted as part of that kind of initial pilot group. Those have got drafts of the assessment plans that have been looked at with the Trailblazers and Skills England and the AOs. They will be the first group that are published, and then it is anticipated that every single standard will have that review and that republication of the new plan by August 26. Now, when you think about the scale of that piece of work being hundreds and hundreds of standards, and how some Trailblazers will have multiple standards to look at, we need to recognise the volume of work that is and the speed at which that needs to be undertaken. So you will need to think about that in terms of how will you fit that into your timescale and your planning. And how will you work with your AOs on that? And then underpinning all of this, and arguably one of the biggest things for you as providers, is your curriculum design. And many of you have just adjusted curriculum designs based on that new annex in the funding rules and the minimum required hours. But actually, this is where your curriculum design is potentially going to be absolutely changed again, because it will depend upon the assessment plan and the assessments that will happen on programme, what they will look like, who will have to deliver them, how they will have to deliver them, where you will sequence them within your curriculum to make sure you are still compliant with the funding rules around new learning and going back into learning again if maybe they haven't achieved the standard. And how will you absolutely make sure that delivers that highest quality training? And that is not a task to be underestimated, but it is equally an opportunity to really look at some innovation and change to make sure that your curriculum is responding to all this, but also is really current as well. So I want to get you going and get you in terms of some interactions. So you will see in the bottom left corner, I think it's the second icon across, there is a reactions little tab. So I've got 4 stages of actions that you need to start looking at. So what I'm going to do is chat you through each of them. And then what I want you to do is give me a thumbs up if it's something you've already started doing, or maybe a thumbs down or a sad face for something that maybe you've not yet got to. So let's see where everyone's at. So the first step would be identify your team that's going to be leading and delivering these changes. Oh, look at this. We've got thumbs up. We've got thumbs down. Oh, it's about 50-50. Excellent. Brilliant. So we've got some organisations who have absolutely already got that kind of task force, that kind of project team, which is brilliant. And others are still working out the space that they're in. And that's absolutely fine. And sometimes what this is about is actually having the time and brain space to really think about who needs to be involved in this. Where are all those little tentacles going to reach to, and who do we need to have in that team to help us? So brilliant. It was about 50-50. So the second action is about working with those AOs, having some discussions and looking at approvals. So who's already started some of this? Again, some have. There's more thumbs down than last time, but there is already some people having thumbs up as well, which is great. But it's definitely maybe a step that not quite as many have got to, and that's fine. Some organisations, if you're an HEI and you only deliver integrated, it may be you've not looked at that yet because we're still waiting for OFS to tell us any changes, and we're looking at those new assessment plans to come through. But for those of you not offering integrated, don't panic if you've not spoken to an AO yet. But what I would say is, once you've started thinking about your team and you've started thinking about the standards, don't just assume you have to work with your current AO. Maybe look at who are some of the other AOs, what wraparound support will they give? Because as I say, sometimes the relationship that was very transactional may not be the one that you need to support you in this new approach. But it may also be that they're amazing and they're exactly who you need because they're a long-term partner with you on other things. So really think about that in your discussions. Right, let's see how we're getting up on the third one. An action plan for all of the things that you need to do around things like curriculum design. I love the laughing face. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. Really thinking about curriculum design, AO approval, wider changes. Look at that. I'm not ignoring you. I've got a third screen. I love the laughing faces. Majoritively, it's thumbs down, and that is not unfamiliar in the sector. There are a few, and I have been talking with a few providers who've been really proactive and really thought about, let's get a plan together. Even if we can't say when, we do know what, but many providers haven't got to that stage. And do not panic. That's absolutely fine. But do start thinking about what might you want to start doing. When might this suit you? Because if those plans are going to be published by August and potentially you're going to have new students very quickly afterwards, you need to know what steps are you going to take, who's going to do it, who needs to be involved, how is that going to happen? And then finally, who started thinking about where you're going to need help from your networks, from your peers, from your AOs, from others? Who's already started thinking about those sorts of things? Oh, bit of a mixture. I've got some laughing faces. I love that. Some yeses, some nos. Excellent. I'd say it's about a 40-60 split. 60% not got to that. 40% yet. We've started thinking about it, but we've not quite got there yet. So hopefully that's given you some ideas of things to take away from today to really start thinking about what could you do to start yourself on this journey. So I've got a couple of poll questions because I don't like to let you sit there and just drink your cup of tea and have a biscuit. We like to get you involved. So Nadine, if you could pop up the first poll question or the next poll question, that would be great. So this relates to what we were just talking about, but it's that finer detail. So how set up are you for doing that on-program assessment? So do you think you've already got it? Do you think you've got some of it, but maybe there's areas you're going to have to look at? Or is this something you've never done and it's a major change for you? Or are you still not quite sure? And that's fine, because some of the assessment plans aren't out. Or maybe you're an HEI and you don't know what that looks like. Brilliant. Only 50% of you have voted, so I'm hoping the rest of you haven't fallen asleep. Brilliant. There we go. We've got some more coming through. Brilliant. I'll just let the last few squeeze in. Brilliant. So the majority, but it's only 49%, partially set up. And then next is not sure, and we're down at 27%. So we really have got a bit of a mixture there. Nadine, could you pop up the next poll for me, please? Excellent. This one's going to be interesting, and you may not know the answer yet, but unless it's a standard with a mandated qual only, and many of you who are in that space will already know it, are you planning on doing that on-program assessment, or do you think you will just default to the AO doing the assessment if possible? So are you as a provider looking to do the assessment, or do you think the AO will do it? Or are you undecided because you don't have enough information maybe? Excellent. It's a harder question, this one. We'd like to get you thinking. And it might be you've not made that decision. Excellent. So where we've ended up is 62% are unsure. And that's exactly where I'd expect you to be about now. 33% of you are absolutely planning on doing it. And 6% of you have said, no, we already know we don't want to do it. And actually we'll work with our AO to deliver that service. And that's fine. And I've had conversations with some very large providers who are absolutely in that space, just the same as some smaller providers who've said we don't have that infrastructure. And therefore, we're already talking to an AO about doing that. Brilliant. And then Nadine, can I just ask you that for that last poll in this section, please? Brilliant. So this one's more challenging, but it allows you to reflect on your current position. How independent is your current IQA process? So the options are: the QA team reviews marking and feedback. The QA team checks that it's uploaded, but they don't actually check the marking. Or there's currently limited or no independent sort of quality assessment in there. And this may depend upon the standards you're offering, so we do completely recognise that. Brilliant. So the majority, as you would expect, is that the quality team is reviewing marking and feedback, but there is still quite a number who have limited or no quality of independent of assessment, or they're not checking marking. Brilliant. Okay. So that's given us a bit of an insight into where all of you are at the moment, but also where we are as a sector. So let's just take a moment to really think about some of what we've looked at, and then I'm going to bring Stephen back in to really kind of give me some questions, and Stephen and I will both respond to those. So we've thought about where we are and what the direction of travel is. We've begun to think about some of those implications. We've brought together some of those questions you need to be asking yourself, and hopefully it's given you some actions that you might want to be taking away. So, Stephen, I can see we've had some questions come through. I'm going to stop sharing that screen. Let's see. Tell me some of the questions and we'll see how many we can get through.
Hi, Emily. Thank you.
Hiya.
Question on EPA costs, as you might expect. Okay. So because of all the reforms, does it mean that the EPA costs will be standardized? Is there going to be a reduction to reflect the increased activity of training providers and possibly the reduced activity of AOs or endpoint assessment organizations?
I love this question, and it is one of the big ones floating around the sector. So whomever asked this question, thank you very much. What is clear is that the providers will be undertaking assessment. However, it is also clear that AOs are going to have increased costs in terms of that quality assurance and approval of providers, but they may be doing proportionately less of the assessment themselves. So the conversations so far, and I don't think there is one single answer to this, and I think Stephen would agree with the conversations he's had with AOs, is that there is not anticipated to be a massive drop in the costs to awarding organisations, but they also recognise that they can't suddenly increase the cost either, because providers will have additional work to do as well. So where we will exactly end up, we are not sure. At the moment, for off-qual regulated EPA, the average is about 11.4% of the funding band is the EPA fee to an EPAO. Whether that will wiggle slightly up or down, we have yet to see. But what I would say is if you're a provider and you're anticipating your bills to AOs to dramatically drop, I wouldn't go banking on that at this point, because the AOs are still going to have a significant amount of work to do in that oversight and approvals that offsets maybe their reduced assessment activity. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a steer, but without a definitive answer.
Thanks, Emily. That's consistent with the conversations I've been having. A good follow-up question, I think, to this would be, we've had a question on, am I right in thinking that AOs can assess all elements and training providers won't need centre approval? So is there an option for AOs just to continue as they are?
This is a great question, and actually it links to one of our polls earlier. So the wording includes the word may. Training providers may undertake. That doesn't mean that definitively they have to. And obviously it will be subject to approval. Now, we have been talking to AOs and providers, and there is a feel across the sector that a number of providers do not want to, or are not in a position to at this time, undertake those assessments. And therefore, they are talking to the AO about undertaking all of those, whether some will be on programme and then the rest at the end. So the wording is currently may. Whether that gets changed, I don't know, but at the moment that is the steer. I believe it was hoped that the majority of providers would, but there is a recognition that some may not be in a position to, or some may not choose to. So that is currently where we stand on that one.
And just a follow-up point, I think that's probably important to highlight. For those providers needing to buy in the on-programme assessment and paying for the assessment at the end, it's going to be a significant cost. So the follow-up question to that was, what are the benefits to us as a training provider?
So the benefits to a training provider of buying in the assessment activity is that you wouldn't have that staffing cost, that IQA cost, that may be significant if you have very small numbers. So you may find it more cost effective on a standard with smaller numbers, rather than having additional staff to have the AO do that. You may find that more cost effective. The flip side is that by having your own internal team that does it and delivers those AO set assessments, it gives your team a bit more flexibility in terms of timing, location, sequencing potentially. So there is pros and cons to both. And there are some big providers with big cohorts who have said, we do not want to do the assessment. We will absolutely buy it in. That is our choice. And there are others who have said, no, we are going to buy in the infrastructure because at scale, we feel that that will be the cheaper option. So there are benefits and downsides to both options, and it's going to come down to your business model. And it may be that you have one approach for some standards and a different approach for other standards, may be dependent upon your staff qualifications, your staff resource capacity, your infrastructure, your approvals. There will be lots of different cogs in that kind of decision-making process.
Thanks, Emily. Just another point that was made, could each AO choose a different delivery model for a standard, or will the Trailblazer set the assessment plan and then all AOs will use that model?
Excellent. It's a little bit of both. So it is anticipated, originally it was anticipated it would be a bit of a free-for-all, and I'm very glad to say that that's been stepped back from. What is likely to happen, and this is the steer and this is the approach that we believe is absolutely now set, although you never know, is that there will be one mandated assessment method within the EPA, and there will then be two or more options as another assessment method that the AOs could select from. So you could have AO1 who selects option A, and you could have AO2 who selects option B. So you as a provider may wish to know which AOs are taking which approach, because you may wish to work with one or the other. Or you may find that some AOs offer both options, and you as a provider can then select the one that you would like for your apprentices. That is still a little bit being worked out by the AOs and the AO sector, but it isn't just going to be a free-for-all, anyone can do anything.
Another important question, I think, is the expectation that new revised assessment plans will only apply to new starts once these have been published, because we've all experienced, haven't we, where the version of the EPA plan has changed halfway through a year. So could, for example, an apprentice who starts their apprenticeship in 25-26 enrolls on a multiple year programme, could the AO apply the revised assessment plan published in 26-27, for example?
Oh, what a question. And I'm going to bring Stephen in a minute to give some extra context to this. There's been a little bit of contradictory responses to this. So there has been discussions with sort of Skills England, DFE, when it was DFE, that students could transition between standards and assessment plans as they currently would. And therefore, once a new assessment plan had been published, that a student would absolutely be in a position to transition with the approval of all parties. However, you would very seriously have to consider the impact on the curriculum delivery for that apprentice if they moved mid-programme, the assessment impact for them, but also how quickly the AO would be in a position to give you those assessment on-programme assessment materials, because they will obviously have to be developed and rigorously checked and approved and all of that. And so I am aware that as a sector, there is recommendations to potentially give more of a window for that. But I don't think there is one single announcement that has overridden all of the others at this point. But it is a very important question, and something that if the sector did say, yes, you can transition them, you as a provider may want to seriously consider what would be the impact positively or negatively on doing so, and you may wish to have a particular response to that. Stephen, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
It's just something that came from the DFE update yesterday that I thought was useful. As we've had an announcement that Skills England is finalising the initial group of assessment plans, which are expected to be published later this autumn. So I don't know how much later this autumn, but that we'll continue to wait for that. What it did say, though, I thought was interesting. While they won't be available for live use just yet, they demonstrate the principles that will underpin revised assessment plans. So I think it'll be really useful when they come out, because that will give us a good idea, but there is no expectation, of course, they'll become live or be used immediately.
Yeah.
I've got another question on, we've had a
Yeah.
couple of questions on degree apprenticeships, if we can just
Yes.
slot that one in, if that's all right. So are there any updates on the integrated apprenticeships who already undertake EPA? So I think you covered that to a degree, but there's been a few comments. Obviously, the university is the AO with integrated degree apprenticeships.
So where the AO is the university, and this is predominantly for integrated degree apprenticeships. When I last spoke to OFS, they are awaiting the Ofqual outcome and any further guidance from Skills England to then inform whether they change their EQA framework for the EQA of standards, the assessment of each standard. That said, as I understand it, every integrated apprenticeship standard, including the integrated EPA, is being reviewed with every other standard by August 26th. And those changes would therefore potentially adjust the way the EPA is undertaken. Whether that will mean some will just move Gateway to post a final, a bit like we have in some of the regulated professions where it is essentially an exam board, or whether that will then change the way or the weighting of EPA, we have yet to see. But as I understand it, they will be looked at the same as all the other standards, and therefore when each standard and assessment plan is published, that will then inform how the HEI will respond to that, but also OFS will then update their guidance accordingly.
Thanks, Emily. I think we're coming to the end of our time, so we'll try and cover some of the other questions when we submit the slides.
Absolutely. So I'm going to hand back to Nadine in just a second, but I just wanted to share with you, just a couple of bits of information about some activities that we do have coming up that I know some on here are already engaged with. So we have further webinars next week, including this one, those of you who haven't signed up yet. And when you get the slides, you'll also have details around two sort of master classes that we are offering to support providers around these reforms and within this space. So please do reach out if you've got any questions. And Nadine, I'll hand over to yourself.
Thank you, Emily and Stephen, for running today's webinar. It's been an incredibly insightful session. As we approach the end of the session, we invite you to visit our website if you wish to catch up on any of our industry webinars on demand. The link is in the chat now. Just looking ahead to our next webinars, here's what's coming up. So on Thursday, the 6th of November, we're running a thought leadership webinar on employer engagement strategies with Ali Bogle. We also have an Aptum Enhance update on Tuesday, the 2nd of December. For all future webinars, you can check out the news and events section of our website. And that concludes today's session. So thank you again to Emily and Stephen for an amazing session, and I hope you all have a great week ahead. Thank you and goodbye.